Good evening, everyone. This is one of my favorite activities associated with my job. So really delighted to welcome you all here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laura Hammond. I'm Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Exchange here at SOAS. And it really gives me great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this evening's inaugural lecture series, the first of the semester, and a double bill extraordinaire from Professor Scott Newton and Professor Eddie Bruce Jones, both from the School of Law. It's a fitting moment to celebrate these two fantastic colleagues. Our first speaker, Professor Newton, was head of the School of Law, Gender and Media from 2020 to 2023. He is a specialist in the laws of Central Asia, but to pigeonhole in that way would be to do him a grave injustice, as I'm sure you'll see in his lecture. His successor to lead the new College of Law is Professor Eddie Bruce Jones, who joined us from our neighbor, Birkbeck College, in 2023, only to be swiftly pulled into academic leadership, for which we apologize. Somehow he manages to keep up his scholarly work as well, and engages in some of the most pressing, his research engages with some of the most pressing legal challenges of our time to do with race, refugees and immigration, and legacies of colonialism. This evening is also a chance for us to celebrate the School of Law and the new College of Law. SOAS is a unique place to study law. Fully 1/4 of our undergraduate students are law students. They come from all over the world, and at SOAS one can study to become qualified to practice law in the UK, but unlike other law schools, students are also exposed to legal traditions and systems from the regions of our expertise and specialism in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Our law school is not just about teaching, though, of course. We also ranked first in the last Research Excellence Framework for research outputs in the country, which we're exceedingly proud of, and we're looking forward to replicating in the coming ref period. Our colleagues regularly distinguish themselves in public debates and legal proceedings, including with the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and other public bodies. Like the other departments at SOAS, this is a law school that is deeply engaged in its subjects of study, and it uses that scholarship to work for justice. So let's celebrate these two leaders tonight, but also when we proceed to the reception, please raise a glass to the SOAS College of Law as well. I have the great honor of introducing our testimonial givers, who will then introduce our speakers. And so let me start with our first testimonial giver. I'll come back for the second in a few moments after Professor Newton has finished his remarks. But our first testimonial giver is our own Dr. Catriona Drew, who teaches public international law here at the School of Law and in the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy. Before joining SOAS, she taught for many years at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. She holds an LLB from the University of Aberdeen and a PhD from the London School of Economics. She's been a visiting fellow at the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School and the Hauser Global Law School at New York University School of Law. So we're considering her sort of an honorary American because otherwise we're all Americans tonight. So welcome, Catriona. She's co-founder and co-director of the Center for the Study of Colonialism, Empire, and International Law at SOAS, and co-founder and managing editor of the London Review of International Law. In 2008, Catriona and Professor Eyal Gross were jointly awarded the Director's Teaching Prize for their LLM MA course on law, human rights, and peace-building, the Israel-Palestine case. Catriona's research interests lie in the area of international legal history, with a particular focus on the law of self-determination of peoples. She's currently completing a book, Self-Determination, The Untold Story of Population Transfer, which will be published by Cambridge University Press. So please join me in welcoming Catriona Drew.
Thank you so much. I'm going to consider you all honorary Scots. So, comrades, colleagues, friends, family, Sylvan, Josh, welcome. It's the greatest honor to be here to speak, give a testimonial on the occasion of the inaugural lecture of Scott Newton. Now, when I was first asked to do this, I sought out some sage advice on what was required of a testimonial. And I got two main responses. One was, pick out the 2 or 3 key themes, their preoccupations, the defining ideas that have shaped the body of scholarship and contribution of Scott Newton. And then they said, or alternatively sketch the key milestones, the biography, the intellectual, the institutional, that led him step by step, logically and incrementally, to take up the chair in laws of Central Asia at SOAS. Clearly, these wise sages had never met Scott Newton. It's 1973, it's California, Scott's at Berkeley studying first Slavic languages and then for a degree in biology. It's 1975, he's on a Cold War junior year abroad jaunt from Berkeley to Leningrad. It's 1977 and he's undertaking a PhD in Chicago on evolutionary morphology. I actually have no idea what that is, but it's nothing to do with the laws of Central Asia. In 1984, he's back in California, this time LA. Scott is enrolled in rabbinical school. 1986, it's Cambridge, Massachusetts, enrolled in Harvard Law School in a dual degree in law and public administration, and then via Legal Practice NYC, legal reform projects for the World Bank in Leningrad, and 4 years in Kazakhstan, Scott arrives at SOAS in 1999. But if Scott's route to SOAS has been, let us say, unconventional, so is his scholarship. Indeed, the unconventional, the unorthodox, the downright subversive, and the occasional contrarian could be said to be the hallmarks of Newtonian scholarship and academic life. His scholarly style and approach are regarded as unconventional. His 2014 book on law and the making of the Soviet world is advertised as an unconventional reappraisal of Soviet law. One reviewer applauding Scott's 2017 book on Central Asian states' constitutional systems said it was the single, comprehensive and erudite study, and yet nevertheless he felt the need to point out to his readers that this would not be a conventional read. Not, he continued, for the constitutional scholars, not for the political scientists, and not for the expert historians. And Scott's breadth and depth of scholarship and teaching are also highly unconventional. For his publications on Soviet constitutionalism to international economic law, from Marx to Spinoza, from Central Asia to Rwanda, or his teaching, in addition to laws on Central Asia, he's taught everything from, and I didn't know this, international arbitration and international investment, to law and development in Africa, from human rights courses on the Darfur emergency, to law and social change, from postcolonial theory, to pioneering courses on AI and the law and the transatlantic slavery. And for those of us who are here tonight from the College of Law, we might also say, maybe just maybe say, that Scott was an unconventional head of department. Perhaps we remember the lesser-known Communist Manifesto of 2016, Scott's bid to be head of department, the opening line of which read, "I'm standing not because I want to head a law school, I'm standing because I want to lead a revolution." Or perhaps we remember fraught financial budgetary meetings on recruitment where Marx was invoked. Or Scott's sartorial style, giant furry Turkmen hats, Sergeant Pepper jackets, and Bob Dylan shades in summer. And who of us could forget the palaver tree, the law department's very own virtual palaver tree, for the department to gather for communal deliberation, for solidarity. But I think what we must remember, and what we most remember as we gather here today to celebrate Scott, as his students, as his friends, as his colleagues, is that Scott's unconventionality has always been rooted in his values, in his decency, in his kindness, in his irrepressible intellectual curiosity, and in the deepest convictions about the place of law and of critical legal studies at SOAS, in the university, and in the world. And so, Scott, if I can return to you a slightly revised version of the words you wrote to us when, yes, as your law colleagues, when having steered us through the tumultuous seas of COVID to triumph in the research rankings, you wrote this, which I've amended a bit. We will toast and feast and dance and prance in due course, but I want all of us now just to bask in the radiance of the moment. This matchless deed is before anything else your achievement, a vindication and a validation of the unique scholar, Scott, that you have become. I have the greatest pride and pleasure in commending Scott Newton to be Professor of SOAS in the Laws of Central Asia.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome you and Ramazan Mubarak, and chuffed and flattered to be delivering this improbable septuagenarian inaugural, which entirely suits since I have always just been getting started at whatever stage of the game or rung of the ladder. By way of gentle disclaimer, at this point, I have no intention to settle my studies, and I prefer to survey the breadth, not sound the depth, of that I will profess. So be advised I am somewhat subversively seizing this inauguration, as you probably are now by now aware, begging your collective pardon, as an occasion to profess across disciplines and straddle hemispheres. If I can twist a couplet of Robert Frost's, it takes all sorts of in and outdoor fooling to get used to my kind of schooling or scholarship. So prefatory apologies to those among you who expected a law lecture from a law professor, because I'm going to have to disappoint. No secret to this community, I am incurably nonlinear, pan-disciplinary, and not especially disciplined, as well as thematically and geographically promiscuous, which started long before SOAS or academic law. Anarcho-Marxist Spinozist, Gnostic historical materialist, Derridian, Deleuzian, Fanonian, something like that. I could tell you I've made a career out of neurodivergence, which is not exactly a virtue of necessity, except that career denotes a road or a course, not peregrinations and meanderings and poachings on others' domains. But thankfully, I've had indulgent and generous colleagues like Tree, by whose incomparable testimonial I am humbled and deeply gratified, and my equally beloved other legal and extra-legal, intramural and extramural comrades, for whose presence here tonight, whether corporeal or astral, I am grateful, particularly for any fast prolonging colleagues, as I am for an institution as freewheeling and polychromatic and kaleido-decolonial as this one, the only club that could ever have had me as a member and which my inner Groucho would nonetheless consent to having joined. And having long ago surrendered any aspiration to either gravitas or seniority, I'm not inclined to reconcile myself to either for this occasion, much less to inaugurate them. This academic dress must suffice as my bow to protocol as I toggle randomly between Senex and Puer as between Eurasia and the Caribbean. And since I bear the title of Laws of Central Asia as designated expertise, notwithstanding my skepticism for both designation and expertise, I thought I should by rights commence by broaching some regionally relevant thoughts and ideas. And let me introduce imperiality, which can be my topic, by noting that Central Asia is peripheral to the two empires which divide it. Given the squeeze between time and ambition, I'm going to offer this and the follow-on taste or teaser in the form of theses, 5 for each, 10 all told, with apologies to Walter Benjamin. Right, thesis 1, the contemporary Russian state is not just a once and future great power, but the inheritor and bearer of imperiality. Many analysts of Russian expansionism, like Snyder, find neo-Sovietism or fascism where I see imperiality, though not to the exclusion of the former, distinct from but analogous to coloniality, a condition or constellation persisting long after the disappearance or dissipation of the forces which brought it into being. The hangover or afterlife of empire, but empire and imperiality here in a specific older pre-imperialist sense, overland, not overseas, dynastic and eternal, the Third Rome or the Middle Kingdom. So empire in a register that is geohistoric, geoepistemic, geoontic, geopsychic, geomythic, as much as it is geopolitical. Continental and territorial scope, expansionist impulse or dynamic, yielding microcosms, self-contained universes, empires like the Roman or the Chinggisid or the Achaemenid or the Mughal or the Mali or Tawantinsuyu across the Andes. Imperial capital and incorporated tributary or vassal nations retaining a qualified integrity. Characteristic of the latter-day state empires is that they arise by a process of what one could venture to call settler imperialism, a dynamic distinct from either saltwater or settler colonialism. Both the Han and the Muscovite empires arose acquisitively and agglutinatively, not by the displacement or replacement of the populations encountered, but by their gradual incorporation in situ as subordinate collectivities and their modest infiltration by settlers, at least before the 20th century, contenders over Mackinder's geographical pivot of history, supreme Schmittian land powers. 21st century imperiality redux entails, inter alia, entitlement, exceptionalism, and wounded amour-propre, a resolve to avenge humiliation and recuperate foregone preeminence and forfeit territory, and the signature anti-Westernism, counter-parochialization, and alternative civilizational order. For the Third Rome, the West is godless and degenerate. That's exactly why Christian Rome had to remove and East, and twice. For the Middle Kingdom, the remote Asian peninsula of Europe came to its awareness late and as a backward and barbaric upstart and usurper, venerable and organic empires facing ephemeral and artificial newcomers. Thesis 2, Soviet Socialist Internationality recast imperiality in a distinctive constitutional mold. It's no accident, albeit insufficiently remarked, that the twin anchors of the Second World, the USSR and the PRC, were empire states in this specific sense. They not only instantiated socialist states and systems, they did so on the basis of carryover imperiality across vast spatial extent and cultural national diversity. The USSR fashioned itself as a model world state, scalable by design, a world union of Soviet socialist republics in Nuce. So the Second World was indeed world size and world worthy. Socialism was a worlding and predicated on imperiality, always more than just the fortuitous national sites and homes of successful revolutions. Socialism was first comprehensively institutionalized in the great imperial other, the only notionally and partially European colossus of the East. Stalin forged socialism in one empire, not just one country, and created a specific set of institutional cum jurisdictional forms to structure it, effectively rehabilitating, pluralizing, socializing, and constitutionalizing imperiality, and creating a showcase Soviet domestic internationality. Not fortuitously had the Third Rome become the seat of the Third International. The nested autonomies, constitutional matryoshka dolls, union republics or SSRs, the autonomous republics, areas and provinces, were subject to constant tinkering and tweaking in respect of their number, size, and borders for the nearly 7 decades of Union life. In nearly all cases, they were pure Soviet constitutional contrivances and had never enjoyed pre-Soviet coherence as polities. Stalin's pen drew the Volga German Republic. Stalin's rubber erased it. Stalin promoted the Karelian Republic to SSR. Khrushchev demoted it. Khrushchev also detached the Crimea from the Russian Republic in 1954 and attached it to the Ukrainian Republic. Internal boundaries were only ever a soft administrative constraint. Next thesis, the Badinter Commission's repurposing of Soviet constitutional imperiality was never accepted. In the then EC Commission, chaired by Robert Badinter, president of the French Corps Constitutionnel, ruled in 1992 that the boundaries between the secessionist internal Yugoslav republics would become international borders. The Russian Federation, quondam Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, suffered but never formally endorsed the application of the Badinter border rules to the contemporaneous USSR disintegration. It carried over Soviet constitutional imperiality into an idiosyncratic distinction between the near abroad, the world beyond Russia, but within Soviet borders, and the far abroad, the world beyond Soviet borders. A cherished usage in Russian international law and meaningless for international law. It facilitated the surreptitious and ongoing readjustment of the near abroad borders and underwrote the grinding, inexorable territorial clawback, the wars of the Soviet succession commencing immediately in Moldova, Abkhazia, and of course Ukraine. The far abroad, meanwhile, blithely and for the most part uncritically, processed the Westphalian normalization of the post-Soviet republics on the basis of the dubious ute possidetis badenter rationale, repressing the contingency and recency of their origins. Thesis 4. In the frame of Russian imperiality, Ukraine has always been a frontier. The Ukraine, Ukraina, equally in the Russian language and political imagination, simply signified the frontier. Frontiers don't have borders, they are borders, like the Russian limes, or borderlands. No formal Ukrainian polity existed until the Bolsheviks conjured a subnational one by amalgamating Romanov gubernias. Historically, Tsarist relations with their vassal frontiersmen, the Cossacks, were fractious and episodic rebellion drew imperial chastisement. Bolshevik relations were notably worse, and smoldering Ukrainian nationalism and perceived defiance of Soviet authority drew savage repression, culminating in the terror famine that killed millions and helped motivate the survivors' widespread collaboration during the German occupation a decade on. Ukrainian borders were never settled, east or west, and the demographics, allegiances, and ethno-linguistic character of the Ukrainian SSR remained hybrid, shifting, and contentious through independence and beyond. Before and after the Orange Revolution, resurgent Russian imperiality under Putin furiously contested what it interpreted as gross foreign interference on the frontier and continued to mobilize and weaponize the preponderant ethnic Russian presence and sentiment in the western mine country, the Donbass. The consequence was more than a decade of stealth, Russian-orchestrated insurgency, including the occupation of Crimea and reversal of Khrushchev's transfer 60 years before. The far abroad looked on in consternation and feeble protest, never explicitly reckoning with neo-Romanov imperiality. Next and last thesis for the first set here. Aggrieved imperiality has proved an ideal substrate for fascization. But contemporary Russian imperiality is hard to fathom absent its profound and pronounced reception of esoteric neo-fascist ideology. Moscow is now the seat of the white nationalist international, and Russian far-right thought is a seething cauldron of outlandish mythologies. Nuclear orthodoxy, the clerical doctrine proclaiming that Russia's nuclear forces are a divine shield for the true religion, manifest in Stalin's heaven-guided but unwitting decision to found Arzamas 16, the Soviet Los Alamos, at the holy burial site of the hermit Saint Serafim Sarovsky, and now officially enshrined in the obligatory portable iconostases throughout the nuclear submarine fleet and in the obligatory blessing by clergy of nuclear missiles. Dugin's Eurasianism, encompassing the rehabilitation of the SS Ahnenerbe, the heritage of the ancestors, Himmler's Aryan Research Institute, only this time with Slavs substituted for Teutons as contemporary avatars. The fascization conceded when the Russians massively accelerated their territorial reclamation project in 2022, outraged Westplaining reflexively reverted to Cold War and Russophobic tropes and invoked Hungary 56 or Prague 68 or even Prague 39. Had the protracted conflict been interpreted all along as a renegotiation by other means, after Clausewitz, of historically variable and contestable borders, and not an attack of the East and the belated fulfillment of 1,000 1950s invasion scenarios, and had Ukraine not been armed and fortified and counseled and defended as a kind of 21st century civilizational Maginot Line, we would not be lamenting 4 years of staggering destruction and a casualty toll in the millions. I'm not condoning for an instant Putin's horrific aggression and barbarism. I'm just noting that territorial nationalism in the guise of either revanchist imperiality or nation-state sanctity is an equally atavistic casus belli, as atavistic as the Munich conference last week, and all the more ironically so as ultimately conditioned by the whims of Soviet constitutionalism. All right, that's the first set. On to part two. And from Central Asian steppes to Caribbean sands, for my second intervention tonight, which I suppose some biographical context is in order, this melanin-challenged geezer came to social and political sentience in the New York of the late 60s and early 70s, at a moment of resurgent black militancy and anti-black reaction. The encounter with the autobiography of Malcolm X would have to figure prominently in my own autobiography, if I ever got around to writing it. The moment and the encounter were formative for my ethical and ontopolitical commitments and allegiances and general critical mindedness. So, at this inaugural moment, I would like to acknowledge and honor the debt I owe blackness and the black radical tradition, which have continued to serve me ever since as matchless touchstones of accrued authority and critical trenchancy, desedimenting and destabilizing the ground beneath power structures in world space or headspace. And thanks to my belated inauguration or inaugural belatedness, I am in a position to inject a lifelong inspiration into a new line of academic research. I'm giving you a brief introduction to work in progress off the back of my post-headship sabbatical, which I spent in and in the study of the Caribbean, thanks to Victoria's post as IDLO representative in Nassau, which alas prevents her from joining my assembled well-wishers here tonight. Thesis 1, archipelagic geospatiality produces distinctive corresponding human geographies. The Martinican Edouard Glissant pleads contra Paul Gilroy for a black archipelagic rather than a black Atlantic. So for me, the Atlantic is a continent, and we are inhabitants of an archipelago. West Africa was attacked by the colonizers. When Africa was attacked by the colonizers, it wasn't a continent, but archipelago. The arrival of the Africans within slavery is not about the Atlantic, but the Caribbean, the source, the origin of the plantation system that began to contain and signify the existence of the blacks. So I am not an Atlanticist. I think that the archipelagization of the deportation of the Africans is a reality. And the Cuban, Antonio Benitez Rojo, evokes the repeating island within the socio-cultural fluidity that the Caribbean archipelago presents, within its turbulence, its ethnological and linguistic clamor, its generalized instability of vertigo and hurricane, one can sense the features of an island that repeats itself, unfolding and bifurcating until it reaches all the seas and the islands of the earth. Islands in a chain or arc float, in isolation but relation. As constituent units of an archipelago, they repeat but lie in a series along a geotectonic trajectory. They are surrounded and separated from one another by an aqueous medium, impassable for humans without waterborne transport, but prospectively navigable, crossable, negotiable. Navigation makes a geotectonic axis a human geographic one, of units in isolation but relation. Archipelagos supply serial itineraries of settlement and exchange, of trade and commerce, of annexation and exploitation, stepping stones, conquering stones, waypoints for directed or discovered passages and trajectories, a discontinuous bridge conjured from a design or an intention or a function, a pirates or gold diggers, a merchants or ship owners, to borrow from Césaire's discourse, a phantom causeway of human desire, of indigenous desire, of enslaving desire, but equally and critically for present purposes of enslaved desire. Islands in the European imaginary are at once paradoxical spaces of concealment and exposure, refuge and exile, escape and imprisonment, of second chances and no more chances, of starting over and serving out. But serial islands replicate and complicate these polarities. And the Caribbean archipelago, here with all its Arawak and Kalinago names, a very few of which have endured, is a fringe or skirt of continent space, a marginal or bordering space, offshore but continentally anchored north and south, constituting an arc, a bridge, a broken isthmus, a connecting space of interconnection. Next thesis, the Middle Passage was a forced concentration, just as much as a forced dispersion. Rather than populations dispersed from a unitary source or site, African captives in the transatlantic trade, underwent concentration. Populations from disparate origins concentrated in barracoons and the holds of slave ships, and then on islands and on the production islands, the plantations on the geographic islands. Not a diaspora, rather, collection from continental points over thousands of coastal miles and vastly greater inland expanses, glissance archipelagic Africa, then concentration in vastly narrower compass on separated but serially connected islands of islands, islands of plantations, an archipelago of plantation archipelagos. Concentration in production spaces themselves bounded, demarcated, fenced off and fenced in, guarded and gated, surrounded by hostile and treacherous off-plantation communicating spaces of patrollers and manhunts of interrogation and suspicion, the Lesser Antilles furnishing perhaps the ideal spatial magnitudes for a plantation colony, large enough to accommodate multiple estates, small enough to be readily governable, manageable, and patrollable. The Greater Antilles, by contrast, presenting a standard reserve of fugitive spaces. Captive labor forces serving production estates on repeating island colonies. The original concentration camps in a vast concentrationary archipelago set in a geographic archipelago, the plantation gulag. And here, of course, is a bridge or arc back to my first Eurasian riff. No accident that modern correctional or penitentiary systems themselves are configured archipelagically, as Solzhenitsyn and Foucault both recognize. Thesis 3, Black archipelagic spatiality and sociality, radicality, criticality, linguisticality are co-evolving and co-constitutive. Theorists and practitioners of blackness as ontology venture diverse characterizations of its spatiality and spaces. Spaces difficult of detection or access, of concealment, like Harriet Jacobs' attic. Spaces in between, interstitial spaces, spaces underneath, subterranean and submarine space, Ralph Ellison's invisibility, Fred Moten's fugitivity, Hortense Spiller's vestibularity, and here, glissance archipelagic space. The formation of a collective black condition and consciousness, a transplantation and trans-colony caste subjectivity as African-descended captive laborers, conditioned as much by the scalar concentration as by the scalar separation in relation, and by the predicative carcerality, in custody of an opposing white force of subjugation and surveillance. Incarceration is in and of itself an islanding, since places of incarceration are separated and moated, effectively, if not literally, fortified and set apart behind a barrier, a perimeter, walls enclosing other walls. Incarceration on an island is a double enclosure, a doubly barricaded space, once by institutional walls and then again by geographic shores. Think of Alcatraz or Devil's Island or Chateau d'If, but multiplied, repeating. A singular plantation island like Madeira in its day could generate a captive collectivity, but not a captive nation. A population united in its condition of racialized carcerality, but divided in its locations at multiple scales, in a kind of fractal archipelagic chromogeography of the enslaved spatially divided by their occupation or function on any given plantation, divided across plantations by the random patterns and histories of ownership of land and laborers, divided across islands by the random patterns and histories of sovereignty and settlement, repeating islands of blackness separated by but communicating across seas of anti-blackness, within plantation, across plantations, and across islands. A psychosocial configuration doubling and tracking the terraqueous configuration and the production configuration, achieving collective self-awareness, becoming in and for itself archipelagically, concentrated but separated, segmented but interlinked, integral but not integrated. Over lifetimes and the long colonial durée, the enslaved thus acquired a kind of nested or scalar spatial cum social awareness, extending well beyond the familiar and quotidian contours of home plantations. The commercial exchange to which they were relentlessly subject meant that their own and familial itineraries after the Middle Passage, cis and transgenerational, brought them knowledge of the wider ambit of their general predicament, the greater sociogeography and chromogeography, the sociogenesis and the chromogenesis of the New World African descended across plantations, colonies, and empires. Fourth thesis. Saint-Domingue is the announcement of archipelagic blackness. The archipelagic emergence and insurgence of blackness is perhaps most emphatically and epically evident on Saint-Domingue, the Antillean theater of the French Revolution and of the separated but connected revolution of the enslaved, a coordinated and then commanded uprising against an entire racialized mode of production by an organized army of the self-emancipated, including white French officers and soldiers serving under black command, that eventually defeated Napoleon's expeditionary force, the largest in naval history to that date. Speaking Creole, perhaps the first language that could deservedly be called black, not a diasporic language carried to and grafted onto remote sites by its nomadic native speakers, not a language of a contiguous compact population, a language that arose in situ across disjunct but communicating nodes, not just within but over the French Sugar Islands, only imaginable as an archipelagic formation, a reverse Babel logic uniting the linguistically diverse West Coast Africans speaking everything from Wolof to Kikongo. And the predicate of that linguistic union was the shared destiny of forcibly converging origin, consciousness, and complexion, blackness. And its announcement to the world came from Toussaint's second-in-command and successor, Dessalines, in his 1804 Declaration of Independence, asserting a black, not an African sovereignty for the first time anywhere, at the same time avenging America, as he insisted, and in the Constitution that followed, brilliantly seizing and repurposing raciality, in Article 14 declaring all citizens of Haiti blacks, expressly including white wives and Polish and German defectors. Okay. Last thesis. Archipelagic blackness also manifests continentally. The antebellum world of the US Cotton South, just as the contemporaneous world of Brazil's Sugar Norte, the North, was a plantation island writ large, continentalized, a vastly scaled up terrestrial, not terraqueous archipelago, analogously but distinctly generative of blackness. Emancipation meant formal decarceration, but barely relaxed constraints on movement and labor. After abortive reconstruction, the post-bellum residential occupation and neo-carceral archipelagos of blackness were thoroughly entrenched and juridified by the force of Jim Crow. But blackness in the northern states, or capture states, I prefer capture and captivity states to free and slave states, I think it's more accurate, had been archipelagic too, distributed in distinct residential, social, and confessional pockets generated by compulsion or choice, election or exclusion, and enforced by custom where not law. The color line ran evenly, but was in any case not so much a line as a knotted and tangled rope segmented and nodal of separated concentrations. And following the Great Migration, after the First World War, U.S. continental blackness remained archipelagic in its distribution as much as island blackness had done. A psychosociologic and not geologic seriality ensured its perpetuation and ongoing differentiation and elaboration. A shifting and morphing archipelagic macrospatiality, plantations into rural belts and urban ghettos, conditioned and facilitated archipelagic cultural and mental and social and musical and sports and choreographic and culinary and literary and signifying and singing meso and microspatialities, archipelagos of jazz and blues, of exuberance and study, of all of which nothing is more emblematic than the Green Book, the road navigation guide of the continental archipelago, designating islands of black safety in the form of restaurants, filling stations, and hotels across an anti-black landscape of exposure, hostility, and exclusion. Blackness had to emerge and cohere in and as a world in the phenomenological sense, but one archipelagically configured, a spatially extended and variegated landscape, broken but not discernibly bounded or bordered, potentially infinitely explorable and discoverable, of folded spaces and receding horizons, hence its radicality, sociality, anti-statism, and a signature suite of modes of critique and performance and expression and expressive performative modes of critique. The Black radical tradition is an archipelagic tradition. It's thinkers and planners and students and performers communicating in an undercommons across dividing and hostile spaces. What Moten calls its ensemblic sociality is just as much archipelagic, propagating island-to-island tools and instruments of reimagination and reinvention, characteristic ways of world-making out of concentrated and confined and intimate spaces, but across a sprawling archipelagic circuitry and imaginary of refusal, resistance, and resilience.
Thank you, Scott. That was a tour de force. I feel a bit breathless right now. I can imagine that you must as well. Thank you. Our next testimonial giver is Professor Avery Gordon, who has been, for 30 years, was a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And since 2015, she has been a visiting professor at Birkbeck College of Law, just next door. In 2012, Professor Gordon was the Anna Maria Kellen Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and in 2020 she was awarded the Bodie Pearson Prize for Lifetime Achievement from the American Studies Association. She's the author of the Hawthorne Archive, Letters from the Utopian Margins, The Workhouse, The Brettinow Room with Ines Schaber, and Ghostly Matters, Haunting in the Sociological Imagination, as well as other titles. I'm not going to read them all. But she has written, and also has written, more than 100 articles and chapters. Her work focuses on radical thought and practice, and she writes about captivity, enslavement, war, and other forms of dispossession and how to eliminate them. She served on the editorial committee of the journal Race and Class, as well as several other advisory boards, and was the co-host of No Alibis, a weekly public affairs radio program on a Santa Barbara radio station from 1997 until 2023. She is an active member of the Hawthorne Archive and was its keeper for many years. Avery, please. Welcome. Welcome to the SOAS. Yes. There we go.
Hello, everybody. It is this is not going to be, you're a hard act to follow, Katrina. This is going to be a bit more straight, but it is still nonetheless my very great pleasure to, first of all, offer my warmest congratulations to Eddie Bruce Jones on advancing to the rank of professor, and so welcome to the Guild. And it's also an honor for me to offer a brief testimonial to him on the occasion of his inaugural lecture. So as you heard earlier, if you didn't know, Professor Bruce Jones taught at Birkbeck for 13 years before he came to SOAS, and it was at Birkbeck where I met Eddie, I think in the summer of 2013, when I was the writer in residence in the law school. And for my residency, I did not deliver the usual series of lectures. I organized a week-long writing workshop that was focused on questions of political and aesthetic representation, and Eddie was one of the participants in that, and that was the start of a very valuable friendship and colleagueship that has continued through my rather long ongoing visiting professorship at Birkbeck, our mutual work on the board of the Institute of Race Relations, many writing workshops since then, and occasional sort of joint enterprises in the art world. When I first met Eddie, he was working on what would become his first monograph, Race in the Shadow of the Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe, an examination of structural racism in Germany and the efforts of activists to combat it. there were then and still are very few scholars researching the nexus of law, race, and state violence in Germany. And Eddie's book was really the first to offer a theoretically informed analysis that situated Germany within the patterns of European racial exclusion and its origins, historical origins in colonialism and slavery. Combining critical race theory and ethnography, the book offered a really astute analysis of Black Germans' experiences with racism and law that yields by the end of it a rather searing critique of the limits of the law as a means to redress social violence and injustice, and a very insightful presentation of alternatives that are produced by social activists. For its analysis of the case of Uri Jallo, an asylum seeker who was burned to death in police custody, the book would be quite important enough, as Eddie really brilliantly analyzes racialized legal violence and kind of vividly draws the reader into the scene of a refugee community seeking immediate redress and also deeper changes in the structure of the society. But the book goes even beyond this by situating the German case within three larger contexts: the history of German colonialism in East Africa, in European racism and anti-racism, the existence of, and the long global movement for Black emancipation. And the book made its mark. Race in the Shadow of the Law is a model, really, I think, of critical race theory, especially if there are any students here. Taking that approach, I think, to new and really ambitious ground, not only by applying anti-colonial theory to legal doctrine, but by making analytically central the experiences of the people impacted and their struggles for justice and change. For 20 years, Professor Bruce Jones has produced a remarkable volume of publications, broadly speaking, on race, migration, and law in a comparative European context that overall interrogates European anti-discrimination law, the colonial logics of contemporary refugee movements, and the legal orders that govern them. This research displays, I think, his signature ability to work with very sophisticated interdisciplinary theoretical materials while always at the same time keeping in mind the practical and the urgent needs of legal claimants who are in distress, a combination that I think is sorely lacking in much critical legal work and that I personally value a great deal in your work. Notwithstanding very, very heavy administrative responsibilities, he has also had a major role as a public intellectual and legal advocate, serving, and I mean really serving, not just lending his name, on many NGO boards and producing major reports, including a significant one on Home Office decision-making on LGBTI claims. Often Eddie's friends wonder if he ever actually sleeps. We do wonder about that. Professor Bruce Jones is also a published poet and creative writer, and this, to me, seems important in situating his current research on the history of indenture, which he is going to address in just a moment. I did not want to speak over Eddie speaking for himself about this hugely important project, but I want to say that I think one of the exciting aspects of Eddie's project on colonial indenture is that in it, the poetic and the investigative are not separate strands of work, but rather like streams of water, which is an important thematic in the project itself, fluid, dispersed here and there, deeply in relation. We heard about Glisson just a minute ago. Eddie might say that the meeting of these modes are what make, quote, diasporic thinking on colonial history diasporic. In a recent essay in Frontiers of Socio-Legal Studies, Eddie writes, quote, the bibliography of the study of indenture is vast, but without the rigors of imagination, one might not realize it. The application of the rigors of the imagination to the deathly archive of indenture and its afterlives is what we await with anticipation with the publication of Indenture Postmortem. And I want to thank Eddie for taking up the earlier work and this also much needed work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eddie Pruce-Jones for his inaugural.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Avery, for your friendship and support over the last 15 years, and for helping me think through issues from state violence to movement politics, and for your writing workshops, which have really influenced the way that I write and think. There are others in the room that I owe special thanks to. My intellectual home for nearly 20 years has been the University of London, from King's College, where I was a master's student and then an adjunct lecturer, to Birkbeck, where I spent the bulk of my academic career with a special group of people who have become kind of like family to me. And now at SOAS here with my new family, which has provided a solid sense of community and very little rest. I'll have to thank my Vice Chancellor, Adam Habib, our Provost, Jana Newman, and Scott, my predecessor, and others at SOAS who hired me as a professor and who've now entrusted me to lead the College of Law as its dean. And thanks to my partner, Jose, who has been an incredible support and has sat through many lectures like this, so I'll make it very quick. I'll say a few words about my career that might not be so obvious from my bio before I go on to the topic. First, a confession, I'm an anthropologist. I got my PhD in anthropology, and I've been fortunate enough to have some incredible professors over the decades that have changed the course of my life. I remember sitting in Cornell West's Introduction to African American Studies course at Harvard as a chemistry undergrad major, and learning that in the first half of the 20th century, one black person was lynched every week on average between 1900 and 1945. So that statistic blew my mind, and while I would have been happy studying chemistry, I was driven to think about that statistic and what it meant that I hadn't learned it in my high school in 4 years. I switched my major to social anthropology and African American studies, and my thesis supervisors, Michael Hertzfeld and Barrington Edwards, and my academic advisor, Anthony Appia, suggested that I apply for a DAAD postgraduate fellowship to go to Germany, because that was one of the areas of my studies in anthropology. And I wound up spending the majority of my 20s in Berlin. So in Germany, I did 3 years of postgraduate anthropology, and my major group fieldwork project was based at Schloss Lichtenberg, which is in Saxony-Anhalt. And the castle in a town called Prettin, a few hours southwest of Berlin on the river Elbe, was used as a subcamp of the large and infamous Buchenwald concentration camp for forced labor and imprisonment. And we traveled there several times through the year, a group of 20-somethings, young kids in this very heavy space trying to grapple with the enormity of the Holocaust and the techniques of memorialization. Our task was to create a temporary museum installation to remain in the space in the courtyard of the castle for several years before the final exhibition was opened. It made a deep impression on me and my sense of how we moved through the space, the impossibility of divorcing intellectual inquiry from material conditions, social politics, and embodied experience. I relied on creative writing practice during this time to help me think through and emotionally deal with that experience, and to think through how affect and social justice sit together. I've been lucky to have been taught over the years by poets like Douglas Powell, playwrights like Amy Evans, and artists like Grada Colomba. The resources also helped me when in 2005, the year the project work in Prettin came to an end, a man from Sierra Leone named Uri Jallo burned in a jail cell in Dessau, spurring over 20 years of litigation and a lot of campaigning and social mobilization. I followed the case as I pursued legal studies, during which time I found brilliant mentorship in my thesis supervisors, Kimberly Crenshaw at Columbia and Susan Marks at King's College. Returning to Germany for an internship midway through, I became involved with the observation team for the Uri trial and eventually joined an independent commission on the case, on which I served for over a decade. It featured in my doctoral work, which became the book that Avery mentioned. I've thought about death of this one human being and the importance of the single case, the single story, quite a lot over the last 20 years. I recently saw the film The Voice of Hind Rajab about the little girl who was killed in Gaza along with her family in 2024, and the storytelling of the film resonated. It didn't focus much on the murder itself. The structural violence embedded in the banality of the rules of humanitarian relief and their disavowal was the focus. It shows that emotion and affect are a window into the possibility of empathy and action, and the ability to fathom the scale of structural violence and its design that's otherwise difficult for us to actually wrap our heads around. The need for engaging with affect and the human story is a part of the motivation that I had when I launched a course that I currently teach, which is called Race, Law, and Literature, which I launched in 2017 and brought with me here to SOAS. Thanks to my colleague Farida Banda for contributing to the course and for the brilliant students who have taken part in it. In that context, I have to also mention my friend and role model of sorts, who's Gail Lewis, a professor at Yale and an honorary fellow at SOAS. For those of you who know Gail, you walk into just a basic interaction with Gail, and you walk away feeling like you've learned something about yourself and something about life. So I use her brilliant essay in my course called Birthing Racial Difference. My current project also integrates these aspects of creative writing and thinking through affect. It's called Indenture Postmortem, and I combine observations about the legal archive of indentureship with humanities approaches. And these approaches are discourse-led and self-reflective. They involve literary interpretation and speculative readings, and they try to get at how we consider the past and how we conceive of what's important about memory. In the early 1840s, shortly after slavery was abolished across what was then the British Empire, a system of indentured labor was established to service those same plantations that lost labor of the enslaved. Importantly, those former slaveholders were paid a large bailout in order to keep British agricultural production going, about 5% of the GDP, or 20 million in 1833, which would be several billions in today's money. In the 1800s and early 1900s, around 1.5 million Indian and Chinese people were indentured to work on plantations in the Caribbean, such as Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, and St. Kitts, and elsewhere, including in Fiji, Mauritius, and Natal, and in Malaysia, and in French and Dutch territories. For those cutting sugarcane, the labor was hard and life expectancies were very short. Indentures prescribed an individual to work for typically around 5 years, after which time they would have paid off their initial voyage and perhaps saved a little bit of money. Then they could opt to work for another 5 years for a paid return trip. Scholars debate whether this was a type of slavery and whether the laborers knew enough about the nature of the work to offer the consent that they gave when they signed the contracts, in an age where many could not read what they were signing. In a legal sense, I'm interested in the all-encompassing nature of the laws related to the indentured emigrants to the colonies. The framers didn't declare the emigrants to be subhuman, as the slaves were declared, but they were explicit in regulating virtually every intimate aspect of their lives, from recognition of religious marriage to different criminal penalties for acts of battery, to penal sanctions for evading work, to separate immigration rules, to restrictions on expressions of religion, and even informal mores about naming and schooling. Suffice to say, indentureship was a form of labor exploitation saturated with the law. In his 1988 epic poem, Coolie Odyssey, David Aberdeen writes, "3 airplanes boarded and many changes of machines and landscapes like reincarnations to bring me to this library of graves, this small clearing of scrub land." This library of graves in a space in the patchy bush is a cousin of the archive. It mirrors the space holding the artifacts that turn out to be the only entry point to any story really worth telling. Aberdeen recounts the double migration of those descendants of laborers who began life in the Caribbean and then continued onwards 1 or 2 generations later to the UK, Canada, and England, and occasionally to the countries of their heritage. The narrator has traversed the world to find a simple patch of scrubland that holds the dead, a figurative catalog of past life, and the actual material evidence of existence, which for many takes on a particular type of intimacy. In Kingston, Jamaica, in 1886, a great storm hit the southern coast, and the Rio Minho overran its banks. Maypen, Clarendon, was underwater. The reporter goes into detail, plantation by plantation, to describe what was lost in the flood. Cane, a son, cattle washed out to sea before they could run, the fence of a pen and wall of a house, 2 fine horses. Quote, a coolie was drowned on the estate, and 5 hogsheads of sugar was washed out of the curing house, unquote. But most notably was not what was lost and washed away, but what was upturned and uncovered. The graveyard at Clarendon Park was flooded out, and the dead bodies could be seen floating down the river. 4 coffins were seen, quote, sailing in the cane field. In an uncanny twist, this scrubland became the burial ground of East Indian indentured workers who were in turn reclaimed from shallow graves or remembered by the river, some by the sea. Death, and more precisely focusing on death as a site of imaginative work, is not meant as a denial of life or fatalism that forecloses further inquiry. Rather, it's an opening. It's a serious and significant opportunity to reimagine the past with a sense of purpose. Focusing on death is a gesture towards haunting and towards a resonance of those underexplored lives in the present. As Gordon writes of haunting, I write of examining death. It suggests something to be done. Death occupies a central place in the archive of indenture. Mortality rates on ships and plantations, inquests commissioned to examine mysterious deaths, significant accidents, mistakes, murders, and suicides all comprise the vernacular of indenture's textual archive. It's a language of reporting to the governing authorities. It's the grammar of economic accountability at the margins of plantation profits and losses. And it's through this language that the event of the laborers' lives are staged in the archive. The code is apparent as one opens the ledgers, and it reveals that the most significant measures of the laborers' lives in the colonial ledgers are the ways that they died. It's not death per se that one is concerned with when examining these records. The shortened lifespan of a cane cutter, for example, says a lot more about the quality of life than about the terminal moment itself. So death, like a footprint, is evidence of things that may not be easy to measure, but cannot help but reveal something about the conditions of life. Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism, always embedded in racial capitalism, as a state-sponsored vulnerability to premature death. So death marks the difficulty of labor, the colonial investments and their returns, and the centrality of loss and renewal in the ongoing economy of family relations, cultural, religious, and linguistic realignment, and racial capitalism. Rates of mortality were a central aspect of the complex moral, political, and financial economy of the indentureship system during the course of its operation. They were not only used to measure the profitability of the system, but also its legitimacy. The statistics themselves only allude to the stories that underlie these deaths. They abstract the lives of those who, for example, boarded ships alive and were carried off, having died, into numbers that would form the basis of policy change or augmentation of the system of indentureship over the decades. Their experiences must be read from the larger context within which the numbers are situated. This requires not only sociological inquiry, but careful intuition and, above all, imagination. Writers and scholars of the indentureship period, like those who have written on the transatlantic slave trade, have used deeply theoretical and imaginative ways of engaging with death. Notably, Vereen Shepherd, in Maharani's Misery, reconstructs the voyage of the Allenshaw, a ship, during which a young woman named Maharani, contracted to work in Guyana, was subjected to sexual violence and ultimately killed during her voyage from Calcutta. M. Norbese Philip composed Zong, a book-length poem that gives a lyrically and spatially reimagined account of the Zong massacre and ensuing court judgment, in which the living people thrown overboard were not recognized as humans. Instead, the issue of true necessity was litigated as an insurance matter. Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts poses the theoretical problem of how to treat the lives of those rendered absent or obscure in the archive, a twin phenomenon to the literal death. Death has shaped the language that emerges when we, scholars, writers, and indeed descendants of indentured laborers attempt to distill the format of the political economy of the indentureship system. Whether we think the social death of crossing the Kalapani, losing ties with home and social place, which has become emblematic amongst those in the South Asian diaspora affected by the indentureship system, or whether we think about the limitations prescribed upon the diaspora for speaking dying languages, taking names that blend into the mainstream and make it difficult to maintain easy narratives of the continuity of culture and lineage, or whether we consider the mortality rates on ships and plantations as serving as a predominant frame for mapping lives of indentured people during the system's height. There's something we can grasp, reckoning with death and renewal, that helps us, descendants of indentured laborers, rescue ourselves in that history of this exploitative system and its traces in the archive. This focus on death in the record, in a certain respect, overshadows the ability for researchers to access details about lived experience of the indentured, perhaps. It mirrors the aperture of the colonial ledgers, more attuned to capturing the point of death as an indicator of the moral performance and market efficiency of indentureship than the details of the perceptions, worldviews, and imaginations of the indentured laborers themselves. The framing of some of the ways indentured laborers died also presents a contentious narrative of the ways they lived. This framing vacates colonial violence from the scene, often imputing accountability for dying onto the laborers themselves, leaving little room to incorporate understandings of the material and social conditions in which they were brought to be a product of the imperial and private enterprises. The ways we grapple with indenture archives is a reflection of how we construct a history of experience with and of the state. It calls upon us to imagine the people themselves, their joy and suffering, about those who they left behind and those not yet in the world. It relates to how we texture the stories of indentured laborers by way of oral tradition, literature, music, dance, and paying close critical attention to the official and unofficial accounts of their lives. Being open to and aware of the situational crises that were present in the everyday lives of the indentured helps us to view those circumstances that kept indentured laborers perpetually and intimately adjacent to death. During the winding up of the business of the slave trade in the British territories, authorities in London were concerned with preserving the economic position of the agricultural estates of the British Empire, whilst importantly leaving room to build social capital and moral authority with regard to progressive democracies of the era, by turning away from chattel slavery on ethical grounds. This can be read in slightly different terms as adopting a position within the moral economy of the times, adjusting structures of slavery to fashion a derivative labor model meant to read as aspiring to both uphold emergent norms of respect for human dignity, sensibilities around labor conditions, and satisfy the voracious appetite of the remnant colonial agricultural economy. This left a gap for the possibility of a different form of exploitation that could be fit within the free market rationales of choice, risk, and compensation. It also kept intact the promise of the civilizing mission, both religious and secular, of colonial administrations. In 1840 to 1841, a House of Commons inquiry is held on the conditions of indenture, which had been paused. A report was issued which raised debate around actual and potential abuse of laborers indentured to work in Mauritius. The laborers experienced coercion and physical maltreatment. However, indenture was resumed in 1843. In the years 1856 and 57, considerable numbers of South Asian people who were indentured to work in the Caribbean died aboard several ships that sailed from Calcutta to the West Indies. The report is an inquiry into the deaths, and it weighs up concerns reported from both emigration officials in Calcutta and in receiving offices in Demerara in an attempt to identify causes of the dysentery that killed so many of those on board the ships. The report spans over a dozen pages and enumerates the weekly death toll on several ships. The reasons discussed in the investigation of these deaths tend to focus on pre-existing sickness and the purported unsanitary health habits of the Indian people, which was thought to have been only exacerbated by poor management or care by the Immigration Office. The deaths are discussed as a symptom of a systems error, and that with the right input into the system, it'll be capable of producing a circuit of cheap labor, sustainably and without high mortality rates. There are patterns in this logic presented in the reporting of deaths of indentured laborers that tends to minimize the role of state and corporate institutions and accentuate the tragic predestination of South Asians to self-annihilate. Focusing on the behavior rather than the totality of the circumstances in which they find themselves involves the concurrent and interdependent deployment of discourses of culture, religion, gender, and estrangement in order to provide a rationale for premature death. So here are 3 quick examples to close. A nullah is a small ravine that leads off a river, and during the 1800s, several nullahs ran off the Hooghly River in and around Calcutta. The Hooghly provided the principal means of steady transport of cargo and people between the regions around West Bengal and the rest of the British territories. And these nullahs serviced the waterway, providing shallow waters that were ideal for docking small boats, loading and offloading cargo, and ferrying goods and people towards the larger vessels out in the main part of the river. Tallah's Nully was one such ravine, and on this particular ravine was a depot used to temporarily house people who had signed themselves up to labor abroad in the indentureship system. In 1871, a person who signed up for work in Mauritius was reported to have drowned in Tully's Nullah while trying to escape detention at the port. The death was reported in a short note from A. Mackenzie, a junior secretary to the government of Bengal, to the protector of emigrants in Calcutta. The letter mentions that the person had been bound in some sort of physical restraint when they drowned. It goes on to instruct the immigration officers to refrain from detaining people in the depots, typically located out on the water, for the safety of the would-be laborers. It's not clear whether this was an unfortunate accident or whether this particular person intended to leave the detention and swim ashore. Perhaps they had a change of heart and decided not to go through with the journey. The letter illustrates at least a tacit acknowledgement that this form of detention could be dangerous for those held in the depots. If this person could not swim well, or their hands were tied together, the only exit was the canal, and it must have been a decision they didn't take lightly, and the ability to reason with the agents and immigration department must have been limited. The state is heavily involved in the system of indenture. The interests involved in the flow of capital, securing infrastructure around transport, and the facilitation of labor relationships with owners and operators of the plantations were all direct results of the public-private partnership. In a more direct sense, the legal regulatory environment, including standards of health and safety, as well as a range of bespoke laws created to curate and control the lives of the indentured, was engineered and deployed by the colonial administration. So by this reading, the note represents the declaration of responsibility for the safety of workers, or at least people in the custody of the administration. But a more sinister reading of this note is that there's been an omission in a summary of what has transpired, and a fuller account would have revealed a more obvious indication of foul play. The tentativeness of the remark and the use of the passive voice when recalling the circumstances of the drowning led the lieutenant governor to suspect the possibility of some sort of constraint being put upon the laborer, employs a legalistically cautious grammar to distance the state and subcontractors from the death on one hand, while warning against the use of violence to force the contracted laborers back into the depots on the other. Notably, it warns against violence in retrieving those who have left the depots, as opposed to those already inside them. Second example is in 1870, there were a large number of suicides reported to have occurred among indentured workers in Mauritius. The causes of death are listed in the administrative report according to categories of personal strife and mental or cultural affliction, without much reference at all to the context of indenture, which was a system of near total control of the workers, regulated by contract law, criminal law, family law, immigration law, administrative law, which underpinned arbitrary violence and social exclusion. The categories are listed as jealousy, revenge, sickness, temporary insanity, homesickness, etc. The category discontent and ill treatment has very low numbers of deaths recorded against it, even in their allusions to the desperate environment constituted by the indentureship period, where the work of cutting cane truncated the lifespan of its workers by decades. The categories place moral culpability with the indentured, implying that they were internally compelled to such a fate, unable to control their impulses or emotions. In certain ways, we can understand these categories as arbitrary, blending out the interwoven aspects of systemic impoverishment, calculated physical and mental strain, and uncertain future prospects. For a researcher of the colonial period, the presence of a chart that highlights the prevalence of suicides among a group of workers so closely observed and regulated by the state is not surprising. It's good business governance to be able to gauge the profitability and moral efficacy of the indenture system, already established to be central features in the global political economy of running these plantations. However, the construction of the categories that justify the suicides are important to analyze, as they displace the conditions that structured the lives of indentured workers onto the workers themselves, muddling the emotional responses of the workers with the most dire material conditions and the social and political disenfranchisement they faced. There's still a great deal of work to be done in analyzing the impacts of the totalizing system of indentureship, including the ways its laws govern the private and family life of the indentured, on the emotional and psychic well-being of the laborers. For this reason, the categories in the chart should be understood as a starting point for coming to terms with the impacts of exploitation. Poverty, for example, is one categorical justification for suicide on the chart. Whilst the condition of living in poverty is not reasonably assumed to be within the exclusive gift of the laborer to prevent, it's placed in the context of other categories that are much more akin to emotional responses to external conditions. And finally, accounting for deaths on ships. The Colonial Immigration Office, which regulated the movement of people between the colonies, including those indentured to labor abroad, facilitated the regular reporting of births and deaths during the transport of indentured laborers between Calcutta and other ports of departure like Madras and the colonies, as well as the return journeys. A register from 1863 lists those who died on one of the return voyages back to Calcutta from Guyana. Notable for the purposes of this study are that while many people died from diarrhea and dysentery, for some of them, the medical remarks included reference to recreational drug use of the deceased, including ganja smoking and opium eating. From the perspective of maintaining the legitimacy of the indenture system, including the well-being of those on return transport, this is illuminating. The indenture system that transported East and South Asians to various parts of the British Empire had been under scrutiny from its earliest years, during the 1840s inquiry, because the conditions of transporting and caring for people on the journey had quite high mortality rates in the initial decades of the system. By the 1860s, there had come a turning point in the direction of the policies regarding the care for indentured laborers, and noting the pre-existing conditions or behavior patterns in the remarks section of the ledger alleviate some of the responsibility of the transporters for deaths. So there was an incentive to complicate the picture of former laborers dying of disease on return voyages by adding other variables with a moral dimension that could be relatively easily attributed to an individual. Weed smoking and opium addiction may have some relation to health, but being that dysentery and diarrhea were common fatal illnesses on these voyages, it seems of relatively little importance. It's also not unimportant that ganja and opium regionally associated more with the origins of the migration than the Caribbean outposts at that point. And those are mentioned as health concerns. One might ask how the nature of these activities is imagined to be outside of the context of the conditions of indenture and understood as an affliction of the laborers' origins, haunting their ability to adjust. This contrasts with the material reality that opium was a product of global trade pushed forward by the British Empire, for example, or that rum production was a principal product from the cutting of sugarcane, and that many indentured laborers would have been working on the same premises as the rum distilleries. So whether it's the characterization of death, the instrumentalization of mortality rates, or the ghosts that are left for us to grapple with in the archive, death as a site of imaginative work is my primary focus for this project, and I hope it will give researchers a bit of space to imagine. Thank you.